Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello and welcome. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled Got a Picky Eater? How to Solve Unhealthy Food Challenges in Children with ADHD and Sensory Processing Disorder. So I do not need to tell you that picky and unhealthy eating is a common difficulty associated with ADHD, whether due to sensory issues, medication side effects, or some other challenge. In some cases, the problem is not picky eating at all, but a feeding disorder like avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Explaining all of this and leading today's session will be Kelly Dorfman, a licensed clinical nutritionist who specializes in targeted nutrition therapy to address complex medical problems. Cure Your Child with Food, her award-winning book about the surprising ways that nutrition impacts common childhood ailments, has been published in 8 languages, and an updated version was released early this year. Kelly lectures internationally and has been featured on numerous television programs and in publications including CNN's American Morning, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and Oprah. She's on the advisory board of the Gateway School of Mumbai. Before I hand over the microphone to Kelly, I do have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, please just look for instructions in an email you'll receive about an hour after we wrap up the live broadcast. For those of you listening in replay or podcast mode, please visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 355 to access the slides, replay, certificate of attendance options. Finally, if you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for the magazine for your family, your teacher, loved one, anyone who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Also, we do have a sponsor for today's webinar, and that is Hardy Nutritionals. Hardy Nutritionals Clinical Strength Vitamin Mineral Formulation, Daily Essential Nutrients, is the world's most research-backed supplement for ADHD, now backed by randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials for pediatric ADHD. Visit try.hardynutritionals.com. Attitude thanks its sponsors for supporting our webinars, and we remind you that sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So now that we have all that behind us, I am so pleased and thankful to welcome Kelly Dorfman to our ADHD Experts webinar series, presenting on this incredibly important topic of picky eating. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Annie, and thanks, Lily, for arranging all of this and making it very easy. So we're just going to have an overview of all the ways that picky eating is affected by ADHD and sometimes a co-diagnosis of sensory processing disorder. And I think I'll just start out with some basic things of setting a foundation about why is this so hard, especially if you have a child with a diagnosis where you suspect has an attention issue, or certainly they have sensory issues. You're thinking, golly, this seems a lot more difficult than what I read about. I should be able to put the food in front enough times and the child should magically want to eat it. But there are some very good reasons why those with attention issues and sensory processing are picky eaters. And we'll talk a little bit more about what sensory processing disorder can look like as a co-factor with ADD. And it's a big co-factor in the sense that there's a big subgroup of people that have it. But basically what happens is that long-term sensory overloading from not knowing how to sort the data in your environment or read it accurately in sensory processing disorder. And although this is not an accepted diagnosis in the DSM, which is the way that we legally diagnose things for insurance coverage and things. It is something that's recognized widely as a syndrome. And what happens is there's immaturity neurological development in certain areas of the brain. And because of that, people misread the data in their environment, and then they don't collate it well. So they spend a lot, about 90% of your nervous system is reading, like, where am I? Where are my arms and legs? How much light's in the room? Do I need to eat? How tight's my waistband? All this information is coming through your nervous system, and you have to read it accurately and then put it in some kind of order so you can utilize it. And when you have sensory processing issues and you have attention issues, sometimes this is not read accurately relative to other people, and you're not putting it in order. So because of this, you can't read your hunger signals. Am I hungry? Oh, I forgot I'm hungry now. I'm so hungry, I'm angry. And you're easily distracted, so you can overlook these things, or you don't read them properly. And so just getting to the table can be a problem. And then because your sensory system is overloaded, this can create a stress response, and increased stress hormones from the sensory overload can increase this sympathetic response. And that means that you have less digestive response. So then you have more digestive distress, or you don't feel good when you eat, or you're pickier when you eat. Do you remember from high school biology that you can be in fight or flight in your sympathetic nervous system, which is your autonomic nervous system, and your heart races, and you're ready to run away from the stress? Or you can be in the parasympathetic part, which is rest and digest. And they don't run together. Usually one's running or the other's running. So if you're in chronic stress, it's very hard to get that digestive system ready to regulate and take food. And then finally, and this is very, very important, there's a lot of sensory data to food and eating. There's the sounds when you bite into something. There's the temperature, there's the taste, there's the smell, there's the color, there's the texture. There's so many different aspects of sensory reading that it's easy to become overloaded and shut down, or become very narrow in what you're willing to tolerate because of that. If you've ever watched a show on one of the food channels, it's just like food porn. I mean, there's just so much stuff going on there. And it's meant that way to seduce your sensory system, which is all well and good if it's operating well, but if not, it can be very uncomfortable. So what exactly is sensory processing disorder? As I mentioned, what we're pretty sure is happening based on studies, not as many in humans as we like, is that there's immaturity in neurological development. And the more widespread this immaturity is, usually the more serious the issue is. All children and adults that have autism spectrum disorder have sensory processing disorder also, but not everybody with sensory processing disorder is on the autism spectrum. It affects how you read the data and how you interpret it. Some people, it's all the reading, other people, it's all the interpreting, but most of the time, it's some combination of misreading data, either underreading the data so that you're not conscious enough, or being overly sensitive to the data. So an example of that would be if dad is cutting up the onions for dinner and most of the family's going, it smells good. When's dinner coming? The person with sensory issues is overloaded by that, and it feels like an assault, and they're running out of the room and saying, it's terrible, stop. And that's an overreaction because their sensory system is oversensitive to that data. So you can overreact in some ways, underreact in others. It's a wide variety of expression. And as I mentioned, it can be widespread or in small areas, but the one symptom that is overwhelming is rigidity. The most common symptom is psychological inflexibility, and that's because the environment is assaulting you so much that you want to have some control about it. So what people with sensory issues do is they say, nope, I'm not doing that. And they try to narrow in their sensory data so it's not hurting them so much. They're very inflexible. If you always drive home a certain way, or you always make dinner a certain way, they weren't made that way. If you try to change it, if the company, heaven forbid, changes the package so it has yellow instead of green, we don't want it anymore. The smallest change can become a real problem, even if it's not logical, because the sensory system is so overloaded, the stress hormones are so on edge that the person with this disorder just wants to control their environment since they can't read it well. And the most common problems in sensory processing issues are eating toileting, and sleeping. And we're going to talk obviously about eating today, but I just want to make it clear that this is not by any means the only area. It just happens that eating is a big area because there's so much sensory data with food and food preparation, as I mentioned, but toileting involves some of the reading of the same kinds of quiet symptoms of how do you know it's time to go to the bathroom? And have you ever thought to describe, how do you know? There's pressure? Is it like something in your mind? These are all primitive nervous system signals that are being read into the brain, and you have to read them amongst all the other symptoms. So often people with sensory processing issues are late toilet trainers if they're young kids, or they can have accidents, or they can get constipated and not know they have it. So that's another big area. And then, of course, sleeping, time to go to sleep. How do you hear that sleep signal? Even adults can have trouble with that. So these are three areas. We see a lot of areas, but these are the three main areas in young children that we often see are affected by sensory processing. Now, I said that sensory processing disorder was not in the DSM, which is the manual for that doctors and medical professionals use for insurance purposes to diagnose and get coverage. But there's a little bit of a caveat to that because there really is sensory processing disorder hidden in the DSM under the diagnosis code of ARFIDS, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is secretly sensory processing disorder played out in food and in eating. It's the only place that they really have recognized that you can have sensory issues that so affect you that it completely disrupts in an abnormal way your relationship with food. So this is the diagnosis code for that, and it is defined as a lack of appetite or interest in food. This is one aspect of it where people, usually children, don't even seem to be interested in food. They never ask for food. They seem to be unaware of it completely. It is not due to body image concerns. So it's not because they're afraid of getting fat. This is not anorexia or bulimia. This is not because of something they're thinking psychologically is going to affect them badly if they eat it. It is, that's a completely different condition. The avoidance is based on sensory characteristics, the texture, the taste, or traumatic experiences, choking or vomiting. Usually this can happen even pre-verbally, so they can't even tell you what that's about. They're just extremely afraid or concerned about food. And it's very, the eating restriction is extreme enough that it can threaten health. I had a child once that I dealt with that screamed so much if a food was presented that he didn't want to eat, that the parents were afraid the neighbors would call the police. And he would scream continuously like bloody murder until they took the food away. So it was a real issue. That's not regular picky eating. It's diagnosed when food restriction causes significant weight loss, failure to grow, nutritional deficiencies dependent on forced nutrition support, such as tube feeding, and or marked psychosocial disturbance, usually other anxiety disorders as a comorbid condition with it. So the thing about ARFIDS and even some of the picky eating that we see with ADHD is that I want you to be aware, and this is really important, that there's nothing wrong with you as a parent necessarily, that we're so quick to jump on parents and say, well, are you doing it this way wrong or that way wrong? This is not about you doing something wrong. It's really about recognizing that you might need additional help, that this is not an average issue very often. So please don't feel bad or ashamed if your child's situation is extreme enough. Get the kind of help you might need for this. I encourage parents to do this very often because some of the behaviors that they described are embarrassing. Of course, the in-laws or the parents or the other relatives and neighbors are horrified and they feel bad because the child is screaming or throwing food or even throwing up. And the general advice, and I hear about this all the time, there's a very famous book that they just say you just keep on presenting the food and the child will eventually want it. Not when there's sensory processing involved. They'll starve to death first. So presentation and hiding doesn't work. You can't hide the broccoli and things. You can't smash up stuff. They are super sleuthers when it comes to finding this stuff. This idea, don't worry, they won't starve. Untrue, not true. These kids are perfectly capable of getting themselves into a dangerous nutrition situation. And the reaction to a small request, just one bite, is excessive and lasts a really long time. Please consider getting some additional help. How common is this extreme version of sensory processing disorder as applied to eating? One study found that 14% of adolescents in eating disorder clinics met the criteria for this. So they were not eating not because of the body image problems per se, but because they had such aversion to food. This actually, interestingly, trended towards male and younger kids when it looked at the ARFID diagnosis. Another study found that when they looked into it more deeply, 50% were secretly afraid of choking or vomiting. And again, if you have a bad experience sensory-wise before you're verbal, you don't remember, oh yeah, I tried that piece of cauliflower and it got stuck in my throat, but this is a different thing. You can't remember those details. It just all gets generalized in the brain as a fear response, and then it can be put towards all kinds of foods. A third of them had mood disorders also, 75% had comorbid anxiety disorder, and 20% were on the autism spectrum. And more ways that ADHD impacts food is that in addition just to sensory processing or apart from it, the lack of impulse control undermines the best of intentions. So even if the food is in the house, it's fair game for any meal or snack. And so it's not just a matter of looking for self-control. That's a problem for kids anyway. You probably remember that the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. And when you're diagnosed with ADHD, that development is behind. And so if you're 5, the prefrontal cortex development is not very good to begin with. But if you have ADHD and you're 5, it might be more the prefrontal cortex development of a 3-year-old. And the prefrontal cortex tells you how to do the hard thing and how to wait your turn and how to think ahead. So these are all things that kids aren't very good at. And when you have ADHD, you're even a little bit worse at it. So very often people bring to me children that are 11 or 12 who have every intention to make the dietary changes we need for their health, and they're very agreeable, and they say, yes, I will do it, and it sounds great, and they can resist everything but temptation. And as soon as the first donut appears, or whatever the problem is that we're avoiding, the milk product or food, whatever it is, they're like, yes, we'll do this tomorrow. And that is normal prefrontal cortex in children's development. So it really makes the parents more responsible to help children, especially those with ADHD, to help them with structures and controls that allow them to deal with this immaturity in prefrontal cortex development. Yes, they want to eat those vegetables as a snack after school, but if they're not all cut up and presented to them, they'll do it tomorrow. And, of course, tomorrow they'll do it tomorrow. And so it never really happens. And, of course, stimulant medications dull the appetite in most cases, so meals must be adjusted around them. I cannot fix this. I don't know anybody that can fix this. The medications are designed in a way, if you're old enough, you'll remember stimulants from the 70s and 80s when they were used as diet medications. And so this is one of the common side effects. So you have to eat before them. You have to know when the medication is coming out of the system and arrange your meals appropriately to that. You can't force around it. The best that happens sometimes at lunchtimes, if kids are on a good amount of stimulant medication, is they'll eat junk, like they'll eat chips or cookies or something. They just are not that interested in food. And so we want to make sure they have very strong breakfasts and that we have food ready for them when the medication is coming out. If it's long-acting, it's 6 to 8 hours, and deal with it then. Mood stabilizers can increase appetite and weight. Those are sometimes medications that are used also, like Risperidol or Abilify, and so that is another complication. And poor executive functioning can mean that plans are not followed or forgotten. And when your sensory system and anxiety is overloaded, part of the problem is that I mentioned that when your system's overloaded, whether the stress is something you're thinking about or the stress is real, you will create a stress hormone. And so that if you're misreading sensory data, which means that there's too much light in the room, most people that wouldn't be too stressful, but when you have a sensory issue, that causes stress reaction. You may as well be looking at a bear, and the same stress hormones are released, whether you're thinking about it or whether it's something that's really happening or whether it's a misreading in the sensory system. As a result, you release stress hormones. And when you release stress hormones, what your body wants when they're in a mild to moderate level is it wants sugar or starch to make them go down. This is why comfort food is an asparagus for most people. What happens is when you, let's say, heaven forbid, you're in a fender bender and you know how upset you are. So if immediately when that happens, you're not thinking, where are the cookies, where are the cookies? But when you get home, about 2 or 3 hours later, when the stress hormones are starting to calm down, you find yourself rooting through the cupboards looking for cookies or ice cream or something, because if you eat sugar or starch at that point, it will immediately pull those stress hormones down temporarily, which is fine if this happens on rare occasion, which is what happens in nature. But in the way that we live in modern life, this is a chronic condition. So we are often 24/7 in a mild to moderate stress state, and we're constantly reaching for these kind of foods. And people with ADHD and sensory processing disorder are constantly under this kind of stress. And so left to their own devices, they'll eat nothing but pasta and crackers and cookies. So this is something we need to be aware of so we can work with that. So how do we prep for success to make a program work better with all these restrictions and complications? Well, one, if the sensory or behavior issues are significant, you need to get professional help. And I mentioned that earlier, but I do want to mention that again. And I want to jump ahead and talk a little bit more about that, just to see if you recognize this in yourself or in somebody you know with ADHD. There are a lot of professionals that are trained to help with this, and believe it or not, if it's a child we're dealing with, the child will behave and work more for them, not because they don't love you, but because they know you're going to love them no matter how badly they behave. And so what happens is that they bring their A game for therapists and strangers. They try harder, and that allows them to overcome some of this and build different neural pathways that can work around some of the restrictions. So you can tell if this is a real issue is if your child will only eat one type of texture of food, only crunchy food or only soft food. They avoid certain temperatures, they'll only eat warm foods or only cold foods. They have very exaggerated reactions to new food experiences, highly sensitive to smells, or even throwing up. I've had kids throw up with smells, or look at people eating something that is not preferred for them and that makes them gag. Those are symptoms that you need some help. Very, very brand loyal. This is particularly a problem because a lot of the food companies use extra sugar and salt to bring up the flavor to a certain point that you would never do in home cooking. So what I hear constantly from parents of kids with sensory issues is they'll eat chicken nuggets from place XYZ, but they won't eat Mom's because most of the fast food places making chicken nuggets are willing to put half a cup of sugar and a lot of salt and flavor enhancers, not to mention any brand names, but there's a very famous drive-through place that we all know that has less than 50% of the chicken nuggets are chicken, and that other 50% is over 30 different ingredients, and most of that is cornstarch. So all the nuggets are exactly the perfect shape and size. They're very uniform. They're very sweet and salty and tasty, and it's hard to compete with that. They'll stop eating food if any small changes is made, including the packaging or presentation. And they can't stand to have unpreferred foods on the same plate or on the table while they're eating. So if you're having any of those big issues, do think about getting some kind of supportive help. Number 2, we want to rule out physical problems, i.e. reflux, eosinophilic esophagitis, allergies with your healthcare provider, because this can also be a complicating factor. Sometimes kids are not eating foods for a really good reason, and that it doesn't agree with them, but they can't tell you what that is. I had a really good GI specialist that worked with pediatric population tell me once that as much as she agreed with children and believed children, she couldn't depend on them to give her accurate information about what their symptoms were. Not for any reason except just developmentally, that's sort of where kids are. And so some of the biological risks for picky eating can be sensory processing, as we mentioned, allergy and food reactions, nutritional deficiencies, and poor digestion and gut issues. Sometimes one of the saddest things that has ever happened, I think, when I work with people is that we change the diet and the child one day wakes up, sometimes they're 9 or 10 years old, and they said, my stomach doesn't hurt anymore. And no one knew it was hurting because it was always hurting and there was no point of reference. So this is a whole conversation in itself. We're not going to have time to go into depth about this, except to mention that this is another possibility for reasons why you may be stuck with your eating situation. The third is to remove empty calorie junk food from the house, because it's easier to remove bad stuff than it is to add good stuff. And as we mentioned, because of impulse control and because of prefrontal cortex development, if it's in the house, the child's going to want it and you're going to be fighting all the time. If it's not in the house, then there's no fighting to be had. You don't have to worry about a sister or brother or a spouse eating foods you don't want the child to have. If you don't want the child to have it, get it out of the house. That's really a simple thing to do. It's better to eat healthy food repetitively than to fill in with empty calories. So snack food is designed to seduce, so you can't eat that. Better to have leftover lunch or dinner for a snack food than to let kids rely on snack foods, because if they're under this chronic stress, that's what they're going to want. They're going to want a diet of snack food. And so find a few good foods they're eating, perhaps, and you'll have to lean into them repetitively. That's not the most perfect thing you can do, but it's better than filling in just so they have something to eat with crackers and donuts and bars and cookies. And along that point, one of my big action points is to fix breakfast. And this is for two reasons with ADHD. Well, the first reason is because it's just a good idea for everybody. But the second reason that's very applicable to ADHD is if you have medication involved, that medication is kicked in. It's usually lasting 6 to 8 hours, so lunch is a throwaway. So if you're sending a child off to school with some cereal and then their medication kicks in, they're not going to want to eat lunch either. And by the time they come home at 3 or 4, they're not there. Their brains are gone. They're loaded for bear, and they're ready. They're ready to eat anything. And very often they're so cranky, all they want to eat is junk again. So if you can get them to eat a good breakfast before the medication is kicked in, hopefully, and then if lunch is weak, it's not such a concern. So I suggest you ditch cereals, frozen waffles, Pop-Tarts, and bagels. All those are quick. Those are the kind of things that they might eat while they're on medication. Not that they're healthy foods, but if you're looking for a time that they would fit into the diet, I generally try to get rid of most of those as much as possible anyway. That would probably be lunch. And concentrate on protein. These days, there's many high-protein diets, so this is not so hard to do. There's you can do eggs, traditional breakfast foods, smoothies, paleo waffles. The Paleolithic diet is a no-grain diet, no sugar diet, and they have waffle recipes online that are made with almond flour and eggs, and so they're very high in protein, but they look like waffles, so sometimes kids will have those. Salmon and fish, which are traditional breakfast foods in some other countries, but they are also wonderful foods to start off the day. Think about it. You need your energy at 10 in the morning, which is why a good breakfast is good for everybody. And even when kids don't have ADHD, parents often complain that lunchtime is too short. The kids are distracted because they finally get to see their friends if they're back in school, which, God willing, that will happen by the fall, that they are going to be distracted and they say there's not enough time to eat. So that would be something to do. You can gussy up oatmeal with nuts, and if you're not reactive to milk, you can use milk for some more protein, or even put a scoop of protein powder into that. And my favorite breakfast, and I think the strongest breakfast, is leftover dinner or lunch, and at least then you'll get lunch in. Okay, and then 4, consider supplements to close the nutrient gaps, and then we're going to make a plan to include the whole family. So let's look at nutrients. There's not a way to talk about every nutrient that is important to use, but I'm going to concentrate on zinc because it is the one that has, I find, the most impact. So the actual deficiency symptom for zinc is poor appetite and also altered smell and taste. And these are things we see a lot in sensory processing issues. And so it's something that's hard to tease out. Is it just a sensory issue, or is there actually a zinc deficiency? You'll recall that with COVID now, one of the symptoms that people get is they lose their taste, sense, and smell. And many of us in the nutrition field think that's because they are too low in zinc. And that has been stressed out because zinc is so important for immune function that fighting the illness has stressed that out. And as a result, they have slipped into a temporary zinc deficiency. So zinc is important. A white diet that's like a lot of milk and white flour type foods are low in zinc. And that's what very often picky eaters are doing. It's found in meat and nuts and oysters and crab and lobster, not that we're eating that very often, and legumes. And so those are the easier places to find zinc. And in general, I think that while you're working out this situation with picky eating, the child's development is marching on. So you want to make sure that they are covered because you can't run on a deficit. We're not the government. We can't run on a deficit. And so the child's development has to be supported. And if they're eating poorly, that's something that's budget cut. And heaven forbid that that's cognition or speed of processing or something that's really important. What usually doesn't get budget cut until the very end and there's no choice is survival. That's the top thing. And so all the learning things that we're very concerned about are subject to possible issues. The brain is 3% of the mass of your body, but takes 25% of your energy. So that is a very big factor. So you can replace missing nutrients until the child can eat a more varied diet, and that can be very helpful. And sometimes people notice a difference with that immediately. Deficiencies during critical developmental periods can have long-term consequences on mood and development. Not to be too scary, but we know that really picky eaters have double the rate of mood disorders. That's been looked at. Now that's not proven to cause one cause the other because we're not going to starve kids and see if they get anxious or develop generalized anxiety disorder. But in looking at connections or things that are falling together, which are weak studies, no doubt about it, but the only kind of studies we can have, there was a high correlation between picky eating and a higher risk of mental health disorders and depression and all those type of things. And so, and of course, nutrition deficiencies can affect the desire to eat and mood. So finally, we want to make a plan. And I want to spend the last few minutes discussing generally a plan for how to do this. And as in terms of the structure, and we can see what you can do with that. I have a very specific way that I do this with kids with sensory issues, so that works well, but it takes a lot of stamina and it takes a lot of calming down on the parents' part. So the first thing is that I concentrate on one food at a time. This is very important. The way most people introduce new foods is like, I happen to be making carrots tonight. How about some carrots? No! Screaming and hollering ensues. And maybe one carrot bite goes in and everybody's exhausted and you think, oh, I'm not going to do that again. For a while, a month goes by and you got to start all over and you never get anywhere. So if you have a sensory issue, the best things are old things that you know. And so the key is to turn a new food into an old food by doing a repetition, because that's how we learn to like food, by eating the same food over and over and over. The first time, who knows? And if you have a sensory issue, you might just be defensive against it. Even the second time, and then the third time, by the fourth or fifth time, you're starting to get to know it. So you want to do one bite of the same food for at least 10 days to 2 weeks, but 2 weeks is better. And you want the child to know what's coming, because kids with sensory issues like to control things. So no surprises, please. They don't like surprises. They don't want to know what mom and dad might have in store for them in terms of what they're going to be asked to eat. So if you make a chart and says, you know what, we're going to, have to try some new foods. The doctor, the nutritionist, the school suggests, whatever, that we try some new foods. What do you want to try? And you want to give them power in as much as you can. Do you want to start with food A or food B, which is hopefully something close to something that they eat already or something they used to eat yesterday but changed their mind about today? And then you have one bite every day for 2 weeks. And then you tolerate them gagging and fussing while they're trying to get used to the sensory data. We offer choices that are changed from foods that are already in the diet. So, for example, if a child has French fries in the diet, you could suggest a sweet potato fry or call it an orange French fry. So there's a difference in the color, there's a little bit of difference in taste, but the texture is similar, the shape's kind of similar, the idea is kind of similar. We're trying to make small changes. We're trying to do repetitive introduction, and then we want to help the child calm down so they can tolerate the new sensory data. And this is really important that you stay calm through this because the child will become dysregulated in the beginning. It's a new food. It's scary. There'll be some dysregulation. And then they're going to look to you and say, how do I deal with this? Not verbally, but with their behavior. And they are piggybacking the regulation on yours. So the most important thing is to stay calm, because if you lose your temper with it, then the whole situation gets much, much worse because they're relying on you for regulation. So if you have a partner or somebody else in the household that can help, if you find yourself losing your stuff, then what you would do is just say, you know what, I'm having a hard time here. I'm going to let Sam take over, and I'll be back when I calm down. When I calm down, not when they calm down. And you try to keep going with this. You want to regulate your own behavior, give yourself a timeout if a child unravels, and all feedback is positive. So if you're working with Justine and the first day that you're trying the carrot, she throws it up, your response is, oh dear, the carrot fell out. Calm as can be, and we'll try this again tomorrow. That was a good try. We want to keep it positive. Everything's good, but resistance is futile. We want a structure that's calm and can be carried through. That's the most important thing with sensory issues, is to keep the sensory system calm down. And finally, the last piece of this is when then. And what when then means is that when it comes down to it, trying new foods is very stressful, or can be very stressful when there's sensory processing disorder involved. So the question is, what do you do to help someone get over that bump or that lump of difficulty? And what you want to do is set up a natural consequence so it behooves them to move forward. So the question you have to ask yourself is why should my 8-year-old, why should Jenny try the carrot? What's going to happen to her if she doesn't do it? And the answer generally is nothing. So why should she? Because it's hard. How many of us would show up at the dentist if we didn't know that the bad consequence of not going is your teeth falling out, right? But as adults, we can think ahead and think, okay, I'm going to put up with it because there's a bigger picture ahead. Kids don't really think like that. So we have to set up a natural consequence. When we're done with our food homework, when we're done trying our new food, then we're ready to play outside. Then we're ready to read our book. Then we're ready to turn on the iPad for 15 minutes. Whatever it is, you set up a natural thing that you do. You put on your shoes before you go outside. We finish our food homework before we play on the computer. And then you tolerate them pushing back just to make sure you're serious about this. So when you get finished with the carrot, then we can finish our video game. And that gives them a little bit of inspiration to do the hard thing and tolerate the sensory data. And then whatever they have, if they gag, we normalize that. Oh, everybody gags the first couple of times. No big deal. Stay calm and carry on. So this has been an introduction to the many things that, many areas of how picky eating can be affected by ADHD. I know that many of you sent in questions, and I know Annie's been going through those. So how can I answer some of those questions, Annie?
Thank you so much, Kelly. That covered a lot of ground, and we do have a number of questions. So primary question among our listeners is, where should they go for help? You mentioned a couple of specific scenarios under which families should seek professional help. So first, people are wondering what professional help looks like. Is that a nutritionist, or is it a therapist? Is it a psychiatrist? And how should they go about finding someone who understands the intricacies of ADHD and sensory processing disorder and ARFID?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the answer is all three of those. It's going to depend. So it does take a little bit of sorting. You might go down some rabbit holes first, but if the situation is primarily sensory, then you're probably looking for an occupational therapist who works with eating issues, or possibly a speech therapist, because sometimes there are oral motor and physical issues. So if the child is doing things like they're taking a half an hour to eat a meal, I would go to a speech therapist who specializes in chewing and eating and making sure that they have the skills to chew and eat, and that and has some experience with sensory issues. If your child's already getting OT, then you could talk to your OT about whether they have experience with eating, and if not, who they recommend that could help you further on that line if you're already going down that road. If the child has digestive issues, or it seems that they're having some kind of digestive discomfort, or they complain that their stomach hurts a lot, they're uncomfortable, they have a long history of allergies, then you might want to look at a nutritionist or even a GI specialist or some kind of medical professional to chase down that issue. And then finally, of course, you can always use a nutritional consultant that has experience with ADHD and with eating issues to help you close the gap for supplements, especially if you have a lot of questions about that and are not sure how that applies to you, or you have a child who doesn't like to take certain ones. There's always all kinds of obstacles. Then you could bring a nutritionist in for that.
Okay. So a lot of options. Is there any resource that you're aware of where people could go, like a directory specifically dedicated to sort of eating disorders or eating challenges? But a lot of people are saying, oh, my primary care physician said to find a specialist, but I feel like I'm looking for that needle in the haystack. How do I find someone who really understands?
You are indeed looking. I mean, I think that in that, because you never, and sometimes people have 2 or 3 issues. You think, oh my gosh, now I have to find a GI specialist and a psychiatrist and a nutritionist. So, I mean, I would talk around to people in your community, and I'm sure Attitudes has some resources also. Sometimes psychiatrists have resources or people they work with. I know I get almost all my referrals from friends of people that already have talked to me, or therapists, a psychotherapist, a feeding therapist, a psychologist, and so people that are working on the ground. So a lot of times specialists you're already working with are connected with other specialists. So that would be another place. And of course, through Facebook groups and everything now, people can find all kinds of communities where people have been successful. So it's out there. It just does take some digging.
Right. Okay. Thank you. A big question is, well, as you can imagine, the whole topic of introducing new foods. A number of people saying that they have attempted to change the breakfast routine, and they have been met with in some cases, temper tantrums, rolling on the floor even, and really having fits that might last an hour. They're feeling pretty hopeless. So you said start with one food. Is there a one food that you would recommend starting with to start the day off right for these frustrated families?
Obviously that's a complicated and a wonderful and important question. I think that, so there's several ways to start looking at that. Number one, is there any kind of protein food that the child will eat another time of day? I hate to admit it, but a lot of the kids in my practice are eating chicken nuggets for breakfast because it's better than what they were eating before. And so if the child likes chicken nuggets, Even though it doesn't sound like the best breakfast food in the whole world, there are some healthier versions of that. And sometimes we can move that into breakfast as something that they're eating already rather than to introduce a new food. The other thing I find that works really, really well is to kind of bring in an expert and not also in terms of to the household by saying, you know what, we talked to our doctor or nutritionist or in the school, and it turns out we all have to eat a better breakfast. We're not going to pick on anybody in the family. We want to make very sure that this is a family affair and not something's wrong with you, Jonathan. That's always an issue. So, and I found I'm shocked, but it turned out that we all have to eat a better breakfast. And so we have to find a protein food that we like and make a list of protein foods and let them pick. Sometimes they can make a menu like on Sunday. So remember, the doctor, the nutritionist, the school says we have to eat our protein foods, and mom's going to have 2 eggs, and do you want to have this or that? And see if they're willing to make a choice, not at breakfast, because a lot of kids with sensory issues are very dysregulated when they first get up. It takes them a long time to get into regulation for the day because their blood pressure has to go up. It's a big physiological change to get going for the day. And so that is not the time to bring it up. You want to let them know in advance. You make a chart, let them be related with it as much as possible, and make sure it's not just them, it's everybody is going to be doing that. And I find that can really help. But you're right, springing on Monday morning, you want side of beef or, fish sticks, it usually doesn't go very well.
Right. Yes. And there are obviously time constraints. Even for those of us who are not going back to school in person, there are still time constraints in the morning, which makes that sort of extra difficult. A number of parents asking, is it okay to try to work on just a protein bar or perhaps a shake that's a little heavier on the sugary yogurt, if that's what it takes in the morning?
Yep, you could definitely do a transition. And the other thing is, as I always start on the weekend, so I'm glad you brought that up, Annie, is that, maybe don't start on Monday morning. That's just a loser right there. So you start on Saturday so that if the child does have a temper tantrum and things don't go well, you can recover from it. But with sensory, I can't emphasize enough, people with sensory issues don't like surprise. They don't want new stuff. New stuff means new data to take in. So they want to know in advance, and they want it to be doable, and they want to have some control over it. So if you can integrate those ideas into it and then expect a little bit of pushback, not an hour of screaming on the floor, but, if they know this is coming, starting on Monday, and we're going to start, we're going to be doing this, but we're going to practice starting on Saturday, and we're all doing it together, and you want to do this or that, and you start with things that they like already. Maybe it's a sugary or yogurt to start with or something. That usually is successful. You expect them to push back a little bit or even scream a lot. If it's a Saturday, and these days we don't have to really be many places, you can always leave. That we say, I'll be back when you calm down, and leave the room and let them calm down, if that's safe to do, assuming that they won't break furniture or cause big issues. They're having trouble taking this in, so chunk it down smaller. If that's too big of a change, make a smaller change and work your way up, which is why I mentioned in the beginning, this takes a long time because they're not going to help. They're not going to help you. They're going to try to keep things exactly the way they are. That's feeding the system that they have that's already overloaded. So we can really feel for them from that perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. Empathy goes a long way in this process. Okay. I'm going to try and pack in some new food dinner questions. There were quite a few, but I think we can cover a lot in one swoop. Quite a number of people are saying that their child just refuses any vegetable. Is there a vegetable that you have found that is more palatable, accepted by kids, just to get them started down this road? You used the carrots example, and people are wondering, are cooked carrots like a good place to start?
Well, it depends on the child. So this is when you have to kind of look at what your child really likes. And so if the child likes a lot of salt, You could do a vegetable that has more salt on it, or if they like crunchy, carrots are better if people like crunchy things, and perhaps they can be cut a little thinner so that they're not so hard to chew up. But I like to start with things they used to eat. So many kids don't eat vegetables now, but they ate them until they were 2. And there's a whole developmental thing about why things change at 2. But they all of a sudden at 2, the good eaters stop being good eaters. So if they used to eat something, that it's good to maybe bring back an old favorite and, remind them, oh, you remember when you were 2, you used to love peas, and then here's a picture of you eating peas. And so we can try peas or, whatever. Usually I find it's the more flavor that helps. I mean, Americans are pretty bad about vegetable flavors, but I noticed that kids really like beef broccoli, Chinese beef broccoli with all that soy sauce. And that's just all the salt. It has a lot of flavor. Or if they happen to have a nanny that's from the South, somewhere deep South, like South America, or from the Philippines, where they put a lot of flavor into the vegetables so they have more interest, that can help.
Gotcha. Okay. And when you're introducing a vegetable or any food for the first time, you want to cook it the same way each time that you're presenting it?
Right, which is why I mentioned carrots, because if you're doing it for 2 weeks, it's easy to get a little bag of carrots and cut off a little sliver.
Right.
But if you're, that's the problem. If you find a Chinese restaurant and one of the kids who actually likes the broccoli there, then how are you going to do that for 2 weeks until they really get into it? And sometimes they get into it a lot faster than that. What you can do is if you have some kind of dish that's cooked up that they like making this up, like ratatouille or something, or that they used to like, you can always get an ice cube tray and put a little bit in each one and then freeze it. And so you can take out one ice cube and that's like a bite or 2. Does that make sense? You can just freeze it up and then it'll last for 2 weeks.
Yes, I used to do that with baby food.
Yeah, exactly. You can do something like that. Mm-hmm. Or else you can just be supportive of your local Chinese restaurant, because goodness knows the restaurant needs help right now. So, and just get a lot of beef broccoli. But it is a little bit tricky. I don't start with vegetables very often with people unless that's the only thing that's really weak. Then we go there. But very often there's a lot of stuff this week. The kids aren't even eating dinner with the family. So you're looking for foods that you can possibly introduce as a family dinner too.
Okay. I think there's a lot of parents feeling pressure regarding vegetables. So lots of questions about those, but that's good to keep in mind that
another cool thing you can do with vegetables that's really easy. Do you remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember astronaut food where they used to have those freeze-dried fruits and vegetables?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And you can still get them at camping stores. Well, Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and some of the health food stores, they have like freeze-dried corn and peas and raspberries, and they're crunchy. So they're like eating styrofoam, but they have a very cool texture that some people like.
Yeah, a number of people here said their child will only eat crunchy things. So there you go.
Yeah, so you can do that. You can do, and then there's a company called Brad's. I have no financial ties with any of you guys. These are just things at the store that makes a freeze dried. You can make this in your own oven. Kale that's very crunchy, and they put a ton load of yeast and salt on it, so it's like cheesy.
Yes, and Trader Joe's has some good. Oh gosh. Yeah, crunchy, like snackies and things.
They're styrofoamy.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So let's see. Here's an interesting question that came in from a number of people. They said that their child will get hooked on a food for some period of time, weeks, maybe months, and then swear it off never to eat it again. Is that a sign of sensory processing? Is that something else, do you think?
No, that's classic sensory. I mean, it could be something else too, of course. But kids, we could do a whole talk about developmentally why kids like to do stuff like that. And part of it, just in a sentence, is that part of growing up is figuring out how much control you have over the world. So the reason that 2-year-olds become picky eaters is because developmentally, that's when you figure out cause and effect. And you're trying to figure out how much cause do I have on that effect. That's why 2-year-olds do what they do. They scream, let's see if I scream bloody murder if someone comes running. Oh, yeah, that worked. Or no, that didn't work. And, let's see what happens when you put the shoe in the toilet and flush, That's why they do all the crazy stuff they do. It's like, how much control do I have? So some of it is that. But for the most part, with sensory, we don't know, but they could have gotten a bad piece, a spoiled blueberry, or it was just Tuesday and they didn't get enough sleep, and that's it. They do this all the time. It drives parents nuts. And so, and you can't talk them into it, but that would be a good food to reintroduce. So let's say they've been off of chicken for a month because they decide they don't like it anymore. That would be a good thing to start with if you're starting to introduce new foods 2 weeks at a time, because it can take 2 or 3 cycles till kids get used to the idea, oh yeah, I'm going to take one bite, I'm not going to throw up, and I'm going to survive it. And eventually the laws of numbers are that you just run into something that you like.
Mm-hmm.
But they also then they'll remember, oh yeah, I do like, because you can talk to your purple, you used to love chicken, that was your favorite food, and they say, no, I don't like it anymore, I hate it. And this is their sensory issues saying, this is the rigid control, I'm overloaded, and I'm not going to control this.
Gotcha. Yeah. There's that control issue. Here's a quick question that came in quite a bit about the zinc that you mentioned. Is there any specific supplement that you would recommend? And what about dosage for kids and teens? How much zinc should we be aiming for?
Well, I can't answer that specifically for anybody. I can give you a general answer. Of course, you should talk to your healthcare practitioner. I'm not giving anybody medical advice. I don't have any ties to any supplement companies or food companies. So I find most kiddie vitamins don't have enough zinc. What I prefer for most kids, when they're picky eaters, especially when they're like 4 and up, is a fairly hefty amount, which is like 10 to 15 milligrams, which is tough to find. But there are a couple of companies that do make chewables. And there's even occasionally a liquid one that will have that much zinc in it. And that can really be a game changer. So if you're a really picky eater, check with your healthcare professional. But usually, in general, I do 10 to 15. And if it's very bad and there's growth problems involved, I can go up sometimes as high as 25 or 30, especially in teenagers. So you have zinc, like all minerals, is potentially toxic, but it's very, very rare. You have to work hard usually to make it toxic. And you'll be happy to hear that the report just came out recently. There were no vitamin toxicity deaths from any cause in like the last 25 years, I think. I mean, it's pretty hard to hurt people with vitamins. I mean, mostly iron is what gets people into trouble, and occasionally these sports drinks can be problematic. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Too much zinc will make you nauseous, and it tends to be astringent. So some of the lozenges and chewables are kind of make your mouth pucker a little bit. Okay,
very helpful. An interesting question from a few people about almost like a food by osmosis. So kids who really, if their parents had even handled an unpreferred food, they would require their parents to thoroughly wash their hands. They wouldn't even want it on the table, wouldn't even want to see an unpreferred food. Somebody said that their child had a salad phobia. This sounded like your description of some behaviors that really did necessitate some professional help. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not pushing medication or in any way, but sometimes the anxiety is so bad that the only way they can even get treatment is to use medicine that calms down their anxiety enough that they can tolerate some introduction and CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy, or other treatments. And sometimes that's where people get stuck, is the child is so anxious they can't even get therapy for it. You saw in our FIDs that there was a high percentage of these kids that had some serious anxiety. So, you can try these techniques and definitely talk to an OT and see what can be done. But if you really get stuck sometimes, just at least temporarily, you've got to get that stress response down so they can have the experience and build new neural connections.
Great advice. Yeah, important to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Stress response. Okay, I'm going to squeeze in two more here, specifically focused on teens, because we do have a number of teen parents of teens in the audience. Sorry, we might have both. So the first one I think is really important. It comes from a mother of a teenage daughter who has ADHD, and her medical team is concerned that her picky eating may lead to an eating disorder. So they've really been encouraging the family to get anything into her. And mostly it's been high fat and high sugar foods. So they feel, pressure from the doctors, maybe righteously, to feed her whatever she will eat. It feels like a bad cycle. I'm wondering if you can address that, like concerns about the maybe bulimia, anorexia, that slope and getting anything into them.
Well, I think we're far more conscious of anorexia and bulimia than we are of picky eating. And believe it or not, this kind of level of orphism and picky eating is actually far more prevalent. And so there's good awareness about anorexia and bulimia, but that's not what she's likely describing. The picky eating is more likely, again, I don't know the situation, but is leaning towards these other issues, which is a different kind of eating disorder, and it's controlled very differently. Because if you just let her eat anything and she already has anxiety or depression, those nutritional deficiencies can push further in that direction. And so maybe if she looks at it more from an ARFIDS or disorder type thing, she can ask different questions and get better help or more specific help for her daughter.
Very, very good. Yeah. Okay. So we're right at time, but I'm going to squeeze in the last little one, which I don't think it's little, but incentives, motivation for teenagers. They're exerting their independence. They have very strong opinions, and parents are really, they need some creative ideas to get their teenagers on board.
I saved the longest, hardest question for last. Teenagers are a unique situation because you're right about all those developmental things. And to some extent, sometimes to be honest with you, I just end up seeing if we can get them just behaviorally to take a bunch of supplements for the year or two till we can get them on board. Because they're just not, the development's marching on, they're getting crankier and crankier because they're eating poorly, and we can't get their buy-in. And, the truth of the matter with introducing new foods, even when they're 5, they're usually not helping you. But when they're 15, they're really not helping you. And so sometimes we just have to do stopgap measures at that point to make sure they're healthy and surviving well. And then the best thing that you can do for teenagers is just, I think, the hardest thing. And my kids all went through the teenage years, and I thought, wow, if I knew this is what it's going to be like, I don't know if I would have 3 kids. But is to realize it's their job to push, and it's your job to stay calm and hold the line. And so it's not that you have to be on their case all the time. You don't have to support them in what they're doing. You don't have to buy Coke for them, but you also don't have to melt down and have a fit, if they bring one in the house. And so what you can do is find a place where you say, these are our family values. This is our value about eating. You can set an example. You can help them put out some supplements for them and help them with that. And then, believe it or not, doing that repetitively over time often works quite well.
Wonderful. On that note, I think that's a wonderful place to end. Kelly, thank you so much for today's session. This was incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for joining us. And Kelly, thank you again for this wonderful presentation today as well. I just want to remind you that Attitude does offer free expert webinars every week.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.